Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to anyone joining us today. My name is Alan Dominguez, and on behalf of the International Dysphagia Diet Standardization Initiative, I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar titled IDDSI 201 Test Methods. We would like to thank our very generous sponsors who allow the work of IDDSI to continue and who support implementation around the world. Before we begin, I'd like to go through some quick housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website and on our official YouTube channel early next week. All participants who are joining us today are in listen-only mode, which means that the panelists will not be able to hear or see you and that your microphone and video will remain off for the session. However, if you have any questions, you can submit them throughout John's presentation. And to do so, you can use the Q&A button on the middle of your menu bar at the bottom or at the top of your screen. The panelists will then address these questions at the end of his presentation, when we will have about 10 to 15 minutes for a Q&A period. IDDSI currently does not offer continuing education units, but in the upcoming days, a certificate of attendance will be emailed to anyone attending this session via a computer. So if you're joining us through a phone line, and I believe a few people are, please email us at meetings@iddsi.org to let us know who you are so we can email you this certificate. Again, if you're attending via a computer, there is no need to email us for a certificate. This will be issued automatically early next week. But if you're attending via a phone, please shoot us an email to meetings@iddsi.org so that we can make this certificate available to you. That is it for housekeeping. So moving on to our main panelists for the session. John Holahan is the president and founder of SimplyThick LLC, and a member of the Canadian IDDSI Expert Reference Group. Mr. Holahan is also the inventor of the company's original patented thickener, SimplyThick. He has worked with thickeners for his entire business career, and over the years, John Holahan has presented to various long-term care trade organizations on the topics of IDDSI, dysphagia, thickeners, and rheology. This includes training and presenting IDDSI to over 2,000 people. He volunteers as a Boy Scout leader, a robotics coach, a rescue dog foster parent, and a church leader. And he also enjoys running and playing the piano. That's a lovely bio, John. Also joining us on the call as guests are Sophie Palmer and Ellen Andrews, also members of the Canadian IDDSI Expert Reference Group, and Peter Lam and Jan Duvestein, members of the IDDSI Board of Directors. So John, without further ado, welcome and please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Alan, and welcome everyone to today's webinar, the International Dysphagia Diet Standardization Initiative Test Methods, or as we like to call it, IDDSI 201. The Canadian IDDSI Expert Reference Group was formed in 2018 to provide a resource to support the adoption of IDDSI across Canada. We're happy to provide you with a short presentation reviewing the test methods and tools that have led so many people from all over the world to choose IDDSI as the standard for dysphagia diet textures and thickened liquids in their facility. Although the creation of the international standards and terminology for dysphagia diets is a major accomplishment of IDDSI, it really is the practical, simple, inexpensive, easy, and evidence-based test methods that makes IDDSI unique. In Canada, IDDSI is supported by the Canadian Association of Occupational Therapists, the Canadian Society of Nutrition Management, Dietitians of Canada, and Speech, Language, and Audiology Canada. The International Dysphagia Diet Standardization Initiative would like to acknowledge these wonderful sponsors for their continued support. IDDSI is an international not-for-profit organization made up of volunteers. Industry has had no input into the development of the framework, publications, or resource materials, but IDDSI would not be able to do as much as they do without the ongoing and generous support of these sponsors. So today, we're going to review each of the 8 test methods included in the IDDSI Testing Methods document. This document, as well as the IDDSI Detailed Definitions document, can be found in the Resources section of the IDDSI website at www.iddsi.org. And please note that today's presentation assumes that you already know what IDDSI is. If not, please watch our IDDSI 101 presentation from earlier this month. It is available to watch for free on the IDDSI YouTube channel, which you can also access through the IDDSI website. The test methods we are going to cover today are flow testing, fork drip test, chopstick, the spoon tilt test, food size assessments, chopstick and finger tests, the fork pressure test, the fork spoon separation test, and transitional food texture test. And so one thing to note about these tests is that although there's 8 different tests, they really only use a fork, a spoon, and a syringe to run all of the tests. And if you don't have a fork and spoon available, there's also chopstick and finger instructions as well. So even though there's a lot of tests, the tools are very simple and accessible to everybody. So this next slide is the primary objective of the International Dysphagia Diet Standard Initiative, which is to improve safety through common terminology for all ages, in all care settings, and in all cultures. This has been the driving force behind anything they've done and drives everything that they have created. Here's the IDDSI framework as it was updated in July 2019 with the addition of the subcategory Level 7 Easy to Chew to the framework. This was added after feedback from the community indicated a strong need for the subcategory of the Level 7 regular diet. It can be useful to think about each of the pyramids in the IDDSI framework as simply a map to help us prepare foods and drink to meet people where they are physically able to process food on their own. If you look at the top of the food pyramid and think about eating a piece of food, you start with that regular food as you process it orally, and it gets broken into smaller bite-sized pieces. Then as you continue to chew and process the food, it gets broken down more and becomes moistened with more saliva. And as you are almost ready to swallow, it really is a minced and moist texture. And if you were to keep chewing and processing, you would end up with a puree or liquidized food in your mouth. So the framework helps guide us as we pre-process food to meet the person where they're able to finish the oral processing on their own. On the drink side, the goal is to increase the thickness just to the point that they can have optimal control and swallow the bolus most efficiently on their own, no more and no less. At first glance, it is easy to think there are 8 texture and thickness levels, each numbered from 0 to level 7. However, if you look closely at the framework, you can see that levels 3 and 4 refer to both a food and a drink. In addition, as mentioned, level 7 includes both regular and easy to chew foods. And there is a category of transitional foods on the left of the food triangle. If you add them all up, there are actually 12 distinct categories of food and drink within the IDDSI framework, 5 drink levels, plus 6 food levels, plus transitional foods. Outside of regular foods and thin drinks, each level has its own set of test methods to be sure that the food and drinks are prepared and served according to the definitions. And this brings us to the measurement dilemma. In the real world, meaning right at the point of eating and drinking, we need tests that can be used to ensure that food and drinks still meet all the requirements of the texture and thickness level when consumed. So these tests need to be accurate, inexpensive, fast and simple, durable, consistent, and reproducible. There are pieces of laboratory equipment that can be used for this, and they are accurate, they are expensive, and most of them are fairly delicate, and they are most useful determining fine differences between samples than the broad categorization that's useful in defining foods and beverages under a dysphagia diet. So here's a piece of equipment you might be familiar with. It's the Bostwick consistometer. You can see that there's a gate toward one end of the device, and when closed, the reservoir on the left can be filled with up to about 100 milliliters of a sample to be tested. Then when the gate is open, you simply measure how far the liquid flows in a set amount of time. There is no universal method for this device, but often 50 or 75 milliliter is the size of a sample tested, and you'll open the gate and test it for 30 seconds or maybe 1 minute. The Bostwick is a good test, except that it needs a large sample. It takes a relatively long time to run, and the device costs about $500 US. Also, you may have heard of viscometers. These two shown here are entry-level viscometers that are limited in their ability to measure viscosity because unless they are modified for it, they cannot routinely measure shear rates. In addition, as you can see, these are not exactly designed for life inside a commercial kitchen. These are delicate instruments that can be easily damaged. In fact, they usually take their measurements by spinning on a delicate glass jewel, and I've had to send machines out for repair the day after I received them due to mishandling by untrained employees. But even with these limitations, these low-end viscometers still cost at least $2,000 US each. And if you wanted to get a full-fledged rheometer that can precisely control things like temperature and shear rate, you would likely spend tens of thousands of dollars. One thing to note here is that contrary to what is commonly thought to be true, the National Dysphagia Diet did not actually specify viscosity ranges for drink thicknesses. It actually found that the data available were so inconsistent and so hard to compare that at the end of at the very end of a 10-page appendix, which detailed the data problems that they found in the literature, they simply called for the collection of data under standardized conditions. And the conditions they chose would be ones that you would be required to purchase very expensive rheometers that cost tens of thousands of dollars to make those measurements. So after careful consideration of all these factors, the IDDSI committee felt that these types of instruments were not practical and sought out other test methods that could be done anywhere in the world, regardless of whatever resources are available. However, whatever test method they eventually settled upon would still need to answer the questions of how thick is thick, how soft is soft, how small is small, and they needed to be based on the best available evidence, be simple, practical, and portable across all cultures. Of course, they have to be reliable and accurate. And if you're curious about any of this, IDDSI has an evidence statement that is available on the IDDSI website in the IDDSI framework section. IDDSI does include specific measurements which minimize the need for personal subjective measurement. And I want to emphasize that these test methods minimize the personal subjective judgment. But as we will see, there still is some judgment needed in these methods. However, I think you'll agree that every effort has been made to minimize the amount of judgment required. So the first test we're going to talk about is the IDDSI flow test. To conduct this test, you simply need a particular 10 milliliter syringe and a 10-second timer. In this test, you're evaluating how liquids flow or don't flow through the syringe, and we use this test to classify liquids all the way from level 0 thin up to level 3 moderately thick or a liquidized food. To perform this test, you remove the plunger from the test syringe and cover the nozzle with your pinky finger to make a good seal. Then you add 10 milliliters of liquid. You are testing of the syringe, usually using a second syringe. Then you remove your pinky finger for 10 seconds to let the drink flow out. And after 10 seconds, the amount remaining will classify the IDDSI level of the liquid. And as shown in the IDDSI flow test card in the middle of the screen, if there is less than 1 milliliter remaining, the liquid is level 0. If there's between 1 and 4 milliliters remaining, the liquid is level 1. If there's between 4 and 8 milliliters remaining, the liquid level is 2. And if there's between 8 and 10 milliliters remaining, the liquid is level 3. And if there's no flow, you have a liquid that may be level 4. Under the IDDSI system, if you're trying to make a level 4 liquid, it is not necessary to run a flow test because it simply doesn't flow, and it can be very challenging to even load a liquid like that is that thick into the syringe. But on occasion, when trying to make a level 3 drink, you may find that it has been over thickened and you will get that 10 milliliter result. There are a couple of notes on the syringe we use itself. There does exist an international standard on the form and shape of the syringe nozzle. However, there is some variation between manufacturers on the diameter of the syringe barrel, and this will affect the fluid column height and consequently the flow dynamics. So it is very important to check the length of the barrel markings from 0 to 10 milliliters to be sure that they are actually 61.5 millimeters long. This is the barrel length that meets the IDDSI standards. And if you're still uncertain that you have a compliant syringe, you can fill it with 10 milliliters of water because a compliant syringe will empty out in about 7 seconds. This is a handy calibration test you can also use if you suspect the syringe you have is not behaving correctly. The two images over on the left side of this slide are actually the IDDSI flow test card. This is a tool many people have found very useful when implementing IDDSI. The scales printed on the left side of the card is scaled exactly to 61.5 millimeters, so you can hold it up to check the barrel length just by holding that card right up there. And the coloring of the marks makes it easy and handy to hold up to the syringe at the end of a test to make it really simple to classify drink thickness. This recently updated IDDSI flow test card art is available for download from the resources section of the IDDSI website. So here's a video that shows the flow test basically just as I've described it. And since it's not working. There we go. So this is a complete training video, so it shows all of the steps, including removing the plunger at the beginning and showing you the most desired position, or the usual position that we hold the syringe for running this test, because it's able to control the syringe and plug it fairly easily with the pinky. Now note, when they fill this up, they're putting the fluid right on the side of the barrel. And this is important because it minimizes the amount of air that gets incorporated into that sample. If you get air bubbles in the barrel, the bubbles in the fluid can disrupt the flow out of the nozzle and can have an effect on the results. So it is really good to avoid those bubbles. Now, as we're getting to the end of the 10 seconds, you can see that it's about 2 milliliters left. And that is going to correspond to a level 1 liquid. So this slide shows some of the evidence supporting the use of the IDDSI flow test. Throughout time and history, many industries have relied on gravimetric tests to classify liquid thicknesses. The posthumous funnel shown here is an example that has been used in the dairy industry for years. You can even find a recent paper where the posthumous funnel is used as a tool to predict mouthfeel of different formulations. It's thought that the geometry of the funnel allows for both shear and elongation that more closely matches conditions in the swallowing tract. These type of tests are well known in established technologies, especially for the quality control purposes. And if you look closely and notice that the geometry of the syringe barrel shown on the IDDSI flow test card here is very similar to that of the posthumous funnel. A more recent paper took a look specifically at the comparison of the IDDSI flow test and, quote, a sophisticated computer-controlled rheometer. The correlation between the two tests was very close to 0.90. And if you look at the data here, you can see the strong relationship just with your eye. So if you assume that you could find a very inexpensive rheometer for only $10,000, and considering that the syringe may cost you 10 cents, I like to think of it as the IDDSI flow test is giving us about 90% of the accuracy for 1/100,000th of the cost of a rheometer. So when you start looking at syringes, you'll see that there are several different tips available. Each of these tips, the first three I should say, the BD lure lock, the lure slip tip, and the eccentric lure slip tip, all comply with that international standard for the tip dimensions, so they're all appropriate for using with the IDDSI flow test. However, the catheter flow tip, or the catheter syringe tip, has a different geometry, is not suitable for use with the IDDSI flow test. You can reuse syringes until they really become unreadable. And you can see that the syringe on the left is worn and it is getting difficult to read accurately. This one should be disposed of. But under normal conditions, feel free to reuse syringes for multiple tests and wash them in between until they become unreadable. The table here shows the BD syringe part numbers that are known to be appropriate for the IDDSI flow test. There's 4 different product numbers shown here because BD has changed part numbers in the last couple of years in their case counts. So they've come out with new product numbers. All of these listed here are acceptable products for running the IDDSI flow test. And note that these are the products available in North America. Under the table, I have included the BD part numbers for products sold in the EU, Australia, New Zealand, and Asia, should people need those in other parts of the world. This slide is shown simply to show you where to find the BD part number on the packaging of a syringe. This is the back paper side of the packaging, and you can see the part number is shown pretty clearly, but it can be a bit confusing because it has the letters REF in front of it instead of a more useful term like part number. And so finally, we have this video, which will compare slightly thick, mildly thick, and moderately thick, all in one video. It's a pretty interesting video to me. Because as soon as the test starts, you can see the different flow characteristics. And I like the fact that IDDSI actually quantified these differences in terms of reading the scale on there rather than just describing those different flows. So it is just a handy, useful comparison that you can see the differences almost immediately when you run this test. So the next test method to discuss is the fork drip test. Here we are evaluating how liquids flow or they don't flow through the tines of the fork. And we use this test in levels 3, 4, and 5. For moderately thick level 3 liquids, you simply scoop or draw the fork through the liquid and evaluate how it flows through the tines. There should be a small amount that remains on top of the fork and no significant mounding, and the drink should drip slowly or in dollops or strands through the tines. We have a video to demonstrate that here. One more click, there we go. Oop. So you can see you scoop through the liquid and then you can see how it's dolloping down. They're not pouring the liquid on top of it. They're not trying to set it on there, but you take that scoop to kind of disrupt the flow and make it come out. So in contrast, when testing a level 4 extremely thick or pureed sample, the sample should sit on top of the fork tines and maybe a small tail is hanging beneath it, but it does not flow or dollop continuously through the tines. And when we're testing a level 5 minced and moist sample, the sample sits on top of the fork and you don't see anything dripping through the tines. So it's a pretty simple test, level 5, just checking to see if there's any free liquids. So the next test is the spoon tilt test. And here we are testing the cohesiveness and stickiness of a sample by evaluating how a scoop of liquid or food falls or does not fall off a spoon. You use this test with IDDSI levels 4 and 5. We're looking for a sample that is cohesive enough to hold its shape on the spoon, but it should not be firm and sticky. The full spoonful must plop off the spoon as it is tilted or turned sideways. A thin film can remain on the spoon after the test, and the sample may spread on the plate after it lands. Note that in this test, we're allowed a very gentle flick to dislodge the sample. This has been described in the test methods as using only the fingers and wrist and not the arm. This is a delicate balance that you'll have to carefully train your staff for. Some facilities around the world have gone so far as to instruct their staff to hold their forearm with their other hand to be sure there is no arm movement is incorporated into the flick. So here's a couple of examples. On the top series of photos, you can see the sample falls off and leaves a small film, and this is an acceptable test result. On the bottom series of photos, it really looks like a peanut butter. And here, you can see it took a lot of force to dislodge the test sample, and there was a lot of material left on the spoon. This is not an acceptable test result. For safety, the bolus should be cohesive enough to generally hold its shape, but it should not be sticky like this. And so we have a video demonstrating this as well. And you can see that this sample just falls off really quickly and really easily. It doesn't leave much of a film. And here you have another sample that falls off well. And here's a sample that's too sticky. But notice how those last two samples kind of look like the same material, and they could be like mashed potatoes at different times. So you have some foods that may start off as acceptable, but as it cools or as moisture evaporates, the acceptability may change. So it is important that anyone assisting with meals be aware of these potential changes and know how to spot the signs. And when it's appropriate during the meal, they may need to recheck and refresh the food. So now we're going to talk about how to assess the size of food pieces. IDDSI does these assessments with the fork and/or an adult thumbnail. The tines and slots of the fork are used for smaller pieces of food. The thumbnail or whole fork is used to evaluate bite-sized pieces. And we use that with levels 5, 6, and we use it to ensure we get the right sample size for transitional foods. Adults will chew food until it reaches a size of between 2 and 4 millimeters before swallowing a bolus. Level 5 minced and moist requires that food pieces be smaller than 4 millimeters for adults and 2 millimeters for children. IDDSI has found that most fork tines are actually 4 millimeters apart, so the very simple assessment to be sure the food fits between is to be sure that the food fits between the tines of the fork. Of course, you need to be sure that the fork tines in your facility are 4 millimeters apart to properly judge this. And of course, food is three-dimensional, so IDDSI actually allows food to be 4 by 4 by 15 millimeters for adults and 2 by 2 by 8 millimeters for children. This does allow for things like rice or chopped up noodles to be compliant with IDDSI without more processing. And note that most foods you're going to test will be more uniform because when you process them and the way food processors work, it's just going to chop it up. IDDSI has 3 other times you'll need to be able to measure samples that are 15 millimeters or 1.5 centimeters wide. Bite-sized pieces of food is defined as a maximum size of 15 by 15 millimeters for adult and 8 by 8 millimeters for children. The sample size used for 2 tests we'll talk about shortly use 15 by 15 millimeter samples as well. This is in the fork pressure test and the transitional foods texture assessment. The 2 tools that IDDSI recommends to measure this size is either a fork or an adult thumbnail. Most forks are actually about 15 millimeters wide across all the tines, and the adult thumbnail is also about 15 millimeters wide. And as appropriate for your needs, you're going to have to measure the forks in your facility to learn how to use them to determine 2, 4, 8, and or 15 millimeters, again, as appropriate. And so we've included this slide from some autopsy data to show you the reasoning behind these various particle size assessments. The goal is always to provide food that is small enough that it will not fully block the airway if it accidentally ends up in the trachea. Adult airways are usually larger than about 15 millimeters, and in children, airways are usually larger than 8 millimeters. IDDSI is a global standard, and it was developed to meet the needs of all ages, all cultures, and it was developed with an awareness that different utensils and fingers may be used for eating throughout the world. So you will find alternative testing options using chopsticks and or fingers in the detailed descriptors for each level as appropriate. These alternative options can be found for levels 3, 4, 5, 6, and level 7 easy to chew, as well as transitional foods. Yes, even level 3 moderately thick liquids has finger test instructions. As you can see here, chopsticks are not appropriate. However, using your fingers, this texture slides smoothly and easily between the thumb and fingers, leaving a coating. Another example is shown here from level 5, minced and moist. Chopsticks can be used to scoop or hold this texture if the sample is moist and cohesive. But please note that if you're going to do this, the person still does have to have pretty good hand control to use chopsticks. And when you use your fingers, it is possible to easily hold the sample of this texture using the fingers, and that small, soft, smooth, rounded particles can be easily separated using your fingers. The material will feel moist and will leave your fingers wet. As we proceed on from here, there'll be a couple of videos I'll show you in relation to other tests that will also include these alternative testing methods or testing options. So next we're going to talk about the fork pressure test. A spoon can also be used here, but it's usually not recommended. In this test, we're evaluating the firmness of a food sample based on the effects of pressing on it with a fork. This is used for levels 5, minced and moist, level 6, soft and bite-sized, and level 7, EC, easy to chew. In this test, you press on a 15 by 15 millimeter piece of food with your thumb in the bowl of the fork with just enough force so that the tip of the thumbnail blanches white. The food should squash easily and not return to its original shape. To be acceptable, we do want to see that the sample is squashed, broken, and changing of its shape. It turns out that this pressure required just to blanch the thumbnail is quite consistent throughout the world and regardless of skin tone. It turns out that the pressure necessary to blanch the skin under the fingernail has been measured to be around 17 kilopascals, is shown in the upper left here on the IOP device, which measures interoral pressure. And it turns out that the measured average tongue palate pressure is 15 to 20 kilopascals. So when we're doing a fork pressure test, as shown on the banana sample here, we are actually simulating the pressure generated by the tongue to mash the banana. And here's a video demonstrating the fork pressure test. And this is on level 6 soft and bite-sized using broccoli. So when you press on that first sample, you can see it's smushed real easily. And then when you come to the sample up front, first you kind of think, oh yeah, it's smushing, but then when you really look at it, it didn't really break apart. It didn't really change shape. It just got stuck in between the tines. So here's a video that'll show us what it looks like if you do it with chopsticks and fingers. And so this first one with the chopsticks, it just smushes really easily. And then again, this piece in front, when they grab it with the chopsticks, it doesn't break apart at all. And then we do it with the fingers. You can see that smushed quite easily right away without a lot of pressure. And I don't know if you're watching the thumbnail, but it did turn white as they put the pressure on there, and the sample did not break. So now we're going to talk about the food and spoon, fork or spoon separation test, where you use a fork or spoon to ensure that the food is easy to break down into smaller pieces by oral processing. And this is used for IDDSI level 6 and level 7 EC, easy to chew. And to do this test, you use the side of a fork or a spoon to attempt to cut through the food with no more force than it takes to blanch the fingernail. Food that can be separated with this gentle force meets the standard. So the picture here is of a piece of fish, just showing how easily it breaks apart. And the final test to talk about today is the transitional foods texture assessment. This is basically to assess whether a food changes texture when water is added to it. It is to simulate what happens when you put it in your mouth and you expose it to saliva. And this is a test that's used exclusively with transitional foods. So to conduct this test, we start out with a 15 by 15 millimeter piece. And it is important to note that when we talk about 15 by 15 millimeters for the transitional foods texture assessment, that this is the sample size only. Transitional foods can be served at any size based on a clinician's judgment that it is appropriate for the individual. But we're talking about taking a standard sample size and adding a standard amount of moisture to it. In this case, we add 1 milliliter of water to it, and we wait 1 minute, and then you basically perform the fork pressure test on the sample. So you push down on the sample with the fork until the thumbnail blanches, and the sample should be squashed and does not return to its original shape. So, okay, we've covered all the test methods for properly characterizing all of the levels we saw in all the 12 levels we saw in the beginning of the IDDSI framework. So now the big next question is, how can I prepare for IDDSI testing? And the first thing to do is to get some IDDSI compliant syringes. Then you can get comfortable with running the IDDSI flow test. And then you're going to need to get out a ruler and measure the forks in your facility to decide how to use your forks to measure particle sizes. You need to ask yourself, are the tines 4 millimeters apart? Is the fork approximately 15 millimeters wide? You can even measure your thumbnail at this point and see how your thumbnail works for assessing that size as well. And you need to download and read the testing methods document, as shown here on the right of the slide. And it's fairly easy to locate on the IDDSI website. And I'm going to show you how to find it because it is such an important part of this preparation. And so you can either type in www.iddsi.org/resources, or you can go to the home page and select the resources tab on the blue navigation ribbon on the top. It is this 5th tab from the left, shown here. And under the 3 light blue navigation sections under the word resources, you should see the general resources tab here. If it's not pink, you may have to click on it to turn it pink. And the framework documents are right there. You can see the IDDSI Testing Methods document here. And honestly, as long as you've gotten this far, you might as well download the framework and detailed descriptors because they're right here above the testing method documents. There are wonderful posters available for download on the IDDSI website. They're available literally just below the documents I just showed you how to locate. So if you just scroll down just a little bit, you'll see them there. So take a look at these and decide which one or which ones will be the most helpful to you and your staff and your particular needs. There are a variety of options that are tailored to different situations, so you should be able to find one that will be the most helpful for your specific situation. Download these and have them printed in a big format so you can put them up on your walls. They'll be a great reference for you, your patients and staff, and anyone that will be using IDDSI within your facility. Let me show you an example of one of these posters. This is a big poster, and it contains a huge amount of information. I won't try to explain it all, but the important thing to know is that everything you need to know about IDDSI and foods is toward the left-hand side, and everything you know about drinks is toward the right-hand side. They're basic descriptions of each level inside the pyramids, and outside the pyramids, you have the testing methods. And so the foods are on the left-hand side, and the drinks are on the right-hand side. And if you look in the lower left corner and the upper right corner, there's icons to show you exactly which test methods and how to run those test methods. Many of these images should look familiar because I've included them in earlier parts of this presentation. So this one big poster, as complicated as it is when you first see it, it really has all the information you need on how to evaluate foods, what foods are supposed to look like, how the drinks are supposed to be, and what test methods to run to produce food to the IDDSI standards. And so finally, you're going to need to do some training. And this is where you have fun. So as you move towards the implementation, you get to play with food, you get to play with your recipes, play with drinks, you get to get everybody together, discuss the nuances, practice your gentle flicks without moving your arm. Or if you don't like the guy across the table from you, you might want to use your arm and flick it on him accidentally. But get everyone comfortable with not only how to do the test, but talk to them about why each test is important. IDDSI was developed with you in mind, the people that are in the facility that are helping people actually eat. And each test for each level is there for a specific reason, and all of it is there to ensure that what the patient is served will match what the patient is supposed to receive as a result of their clinical evaluation. We did put together this very simple testing reference guide for you for this presentation. It is a simple depiction of what test methods go with each level of the IDDSI framework. For example, you can see that soft and bite size level 6, when you look down in the lower left, requires the fork spoon separation test, the fork pressure test, and the food size assessment. It's just a simple reference guide for you, but hopefully you'll find it useful, and it helps kind of bring all these test methods together. So when you put everything together, this is what it looks like. We've got a level 5 meat, and we need to assess it to make sure that it is proper for a level 5, minced and moist. First thing you're going to do is you're going to do the fork pressure test. And when you press on that, you can see that the particles go right through the tines, so they're small enough and it's not too stiff. And then the next thing you do is pick that scoop of meat up, and you'd see that nothing's dripping out of it, so it's appropriate. And then you need to do a spoon tilt test, so you grab your spoon and you scoop up some of it, and it falls right off. If you didn't have a fork and spoon available to you, you do the chopstick test. And you can pick it up pretty easily, and there's no loose liquid, free liquid dripping out of there, so it looks good. And if you want to test it with your fingers, you can pick up a piece. As you rub your fingers, they break apart easily into smaller pieces, and your fingers are left moist and wet. More information and training can be found on the IDDSI YouTube channel. This presentation will be there in the next week or so. And you'll find many other educational presentations there as well, including the IDDSI 101 presentation that was given a couple weeks ago. And I know I've already shown you the website, but to remind you that the IDDSI website has so many resources available to you. Please visit it regularly and explore it. It really is the best place to educate yourself and to get the most up-to-date information and resources. And as long as you're there exploring the website, be sure to subscribe to the IDDSI newsletter. It really is a great way to stay on top of news and updates, and they even answer some hard questions, and it'll be sent right to your inbox. So it's a good way to keep up to date on what's going on. IDDSI does have an app, both in the Apple App Store and in the Google Play Store. And once you download it and create an account, you download the IDDSI data right to your phone. Then you'll be able to access the framework documents and videos anywhere you go. Yes, it has videos, it has the frameworks, it's a very valuable tool. And once you have it downloaded, after that initial download, then you have the data with you wherever you go and whatever you're doing in your facility. And so that is really all that I have prepared for you today. We have about 20 minutes left to answer your questions.
Thank you, John. That was fantastic. So before we move on to questions, I just want to remind everyone, as you just did, that this webinar is being recorded, and recording will be available on our YouTube channel that you kindly shared. So it'll be ready probably early next week, as well as the certificate of attendances. I see that we do have folks joining us on the phone, so please email meetings@iddsi.org to receive your certificate of attendance. And just one more thing, we begin with your questions. We do have another webinar, an upcoming webinar next Friday, May 29th at the same time, and that is an IDDSI 301 implementation presented by Ellen Andrews, who is also joining us on the call today as a guest, and she will lead us through implementation in your workplace and different facilities. So please, you can find the registration information on our website and on our upcoming eBite as well. So John, thank you again, and we do have already some questions coming in, so why don't I get started with Joshua is asking, knowing that some patients in any facility will use plastic forks instead of metal forks at service, is it more appropriate to use plastic fork when testing?
I don't think it particularly matters, because the amount of force it takes to blanch the thumbnail is not going to make that much of a difference if the food is soft enough.
Great, thank you. Next question. How do foods that contain skins, such as fruit and vegetables, fit into the guidelines? Does the presence of skin make the item non-compliant?
Peter, can you jump in on this one?
Sure, John. Happy to help answer this one. Yes, the presence of skin, such as in fruits and vegetables, will not fit into the levels that are asking for a smooth texture and a uniform texture. Skins, peels that are in fruits and vegetables sometimes do not texture modify into a cohesive and homogeneous type of a bolus. So what can possibly happen is you would get particles of the fruits, skins or peels and vegetable peels separating out of that bolus. So unless the skins or the peels are cooked to a very, very soft level that matches the majority of the bolus and can actually then be transported in the whole swallow process in a cohesive way, this is the reason why we ask people to be careful about the presence of skin and peels, seeds, as you can see in our detailed descriptions.
Great, thank you, Peter. Thank you, John. Next question. Here, I have a follow-up question on the metal fork and plastic. Any comments on plastic versus metal fork regarding the slip or viscosity for flick testing?
I don't think there's going to be any significant difference. If you're going to have acceptable, it's going to fall off plastic or metal. And if you're going to have something that's going to stick, it's going to stick to either. I don't know that I've seen a difference between those.
Thank you. How often is it suggested to repeat running tests on the regular menu items?
I believe that the way to answer that is it's going to depend on your normal auditing frequency. And when you go through the menu development process, the confidence you have in your process to produce that food. And so there is a regular audit process that you should go through, and just depending on what your facility chooses for their quality standards, or from your experience, how often you need to audit it. But if you're talking about over the course of a meal, it's going to depend on if you have confidence in that particular recipe and your recipe development, if you notice changes. So if you have confidence in, say, your thickened liquids, that they're not going to continue to thicken, you don't need to check it during the meal. But like if you have a mashed potato that you know as it evaporates and dries out, it becomes harder, then that's one you're just going to have to watch with more frequency. Do you have anything to add to that, Peter?
No, I think, again, this is something that each organization, each site, practice area will have to decide for themselves. And it really depends on your quality assurance policies that are in place. So IDDSI, that's the reason why IDDSI has not recommended or suggested frequency in terms of testing. The only thing that we're really wanting people to pay attention to is that the testing should happen at the point of service, just to make sure that the food that perhaps have originally been tested, or the liquids that have originally been tested prior to service, is still behaving in an acceptable way at the point when somebody is actually eating it or drinking it. And then if you look at the audit tools that we have, or the audit sheets that we have available on our website, we're also asking people when they're doing their initial testing to check what happens to the products 15 minutes after service and 30 minutes after service. And we know from some sites that have successfully implemented IDDSI, they're saying that they even checked to see what happens an hour after the product has been served, just to see the change in the product so that they can be aware of how to properly refresh it.
Great, thank you, Peter, and thank you, John. I have another question. Are the IDDSI tests supported by evidence?
I'll say yes. Each of them is designed to, that they're based on scientific principles. So like the liquid test, I showed a couple examples of the evidence supporting those. Obviously, if you're talking about particle size reductions, we're using tools to make sure that we hit that. When you get into something like how much force is in a gentle flick, to make sure that it's not too sticky, that's an area where the research is still developing, which is why having some consistency to make sure that you all agree what a gentle flick is going to be important. But we do know from practical experience that if it slides right off, that's what you're looking for, is something that's not too sticky. And because, you know, when you push with a standard amount of pressure, you're kind of checking it, and as indicated in the slides, that fork pressure test is providing about the same amount of pressure as the tongue can produce up with the palate.
John, if you don't mind, I'll jump in
Sure.
here and add to that. In the development process of IDDSI, we did our best to incorporate as much of the evidence that's available out there. And please note that what we were trying to do is actually not only to try to marry the availability of the current clinical evidence in swallowing and swallowing disorder research, but we were also trying to incorporate research and findings from food science, the testing methods that are used there, in commercial production and research and development. Expensive instruments like texture analyzers are used, and other types of testing that may not be practical, as John alluded to, in a residential setting, in a aged care home setting, kitchen, or even in a hospital kitchen. So what IDDSI has tried to do is make sure that we use the best evidence that is currently available to us, and have recommended these testing methods that best simulate those oral processing conditions that would help to break down food or to assess the flow of a liquid, to then allow people to be consistent in the way that they communicate with each other by using the standardized terminology. We have never professed that IDDSI is perfect. And for our listeners, if anybody has done further extensive research and have evidence to bring forward to help IDDSI become even better than what it is now, we absolutely welcome that kind of information and collaboration. And so what we would like everyone to know is IDDSI will continue to evolve, but at this point in time, for now, this is the best that we have gathered to present as an international set of standards.
I guess I would just add on a little bit, Peter, that when you're talking about test methods and you're balancing between, buying really delicate and expensive pieces of equipment and being able to test something quickly, you have to ask yourself, what are you trying to test? And so, for example, we know that stickiness and cohesiveness is an important characteristic that needs to be tested. And there are instruments that will do that, but they're just not practical when when somebody's feeding themselves and you're wondering, did that get too sticky? So having something, like the spoon test, which seems very, very simple, is, kind of making best use of what you have so that you can see, and you know that if it sticks to that spoon, it's too sticky. And if it slides off, it's okay. It's a good proxy. It may not be something that you can write papers and get a PhD based on studying, but it is a good practical test for testing what we're trying to control at that moment.
Great, thank you. I have another question regarding data and evidence. Is there any research regarding appropriate liquid thickness with infants using a bottle versus using a flow size of nipple?
That is a question that's outside my expertise. Jan, maybe?
Yeah, can you hear me? All right.
Yes.
Okay, just in terms of that appropriate liquid thickness, I think that's a very big question, because the whole area of liquid thickness for infants is very much up there for debate. And I think obviously a lot of times clinicians will use other means rather than going to thickening, if possible. So I think that's one thing to consider on that. And there certainly is research that has there's plenty of research in the literature just around different kinds of the aspects of different kinds of thickening to be used. I don't think you could say there's one particular thickness that has been, and obviously you generally will try and go with as thin as possible in relation to that child because of the problems with efficiency through sucking. In regard to the nipple flow, absolutely, because you've got two factors there, faster flow versus slower flow. And I would suggest take a look at the research by Padros. They did a lot of work on different nipple flows, different types of nipples and the flow rates with those. So clearly, if you are going to something thicker, you might have to be looking at a nipple that has a slightly larger or faster flow rate in order to balance the efficiency issues for that infant. But again, there's a lot of questions in that. So I think there's clinically, the clinician needs to really think through what the process would be in terms of trying to move forward with any particular child or infant.
Thank you, Jan. Okay, moving on. Is adding additional fat to food an acceptable method to ensure food passes the spoon tilt test? Do you have any recommendations on additives that are often helpful in preventing stickiness?
Peter or Ellen, would you like to comment on that?
Sure, John. Adding additional fat to food is an acceptable method. And again, this is where you would be advised to work with your nutrition professionals, colleagues, just to make sure that the person actually can tolerate the additional fat to the food, and how much is acceptable. There have been some chef consultants that have been working with IDDSI, and they've demonstrated that for some foods, when you add extra fat, it actually may make it stickier. Whereas there are some foods where when you add the extra fat and moisture, actually does make the food less sticky. So I'm afraid there is no standard answer to this, and there is no standardized recipe, because we will have foods prepared in different conditions, different humidity levels, and the one thing that often seems to help is if you have a fat that becomes, if you have a food that becomes more sticky, the thing to really think about is how did it become sticky? Is it actually more sticky because it has moisture that has evaporated from that particular food? And if that's the case, then if we add that moisture back into the food, does it then refresh it to make it less sticky? And the example here would be mashed potatoes. If it sits out and it's a temperature issue because the food has actually cooled, and in this case, because the fat could actually become thicker and stickier as it cools, then do we need to warm the food back up? And I think that's what we're trying to get people to start thinking about. And I'll just answer another question that is commonly asked of IDDSI, which is, why don't we have a list of foods allowed and foods not allowed, as we've seen in past diet writing guidelines? And so this is the reason why. It's because the behavior of food can be so variable that the same food, when prepared appropriately, can pass the IDDSI testing, and then when it's been subjected to various conditions, temperature changes or change in moisture content, it may not pass the IDDSI testing. And that is the reason why the IDDSI testing methods are in place for people to be able to then check on their own.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, John. We only have a few more minutes, but I'm hoping that we can get through a few more questions. So if a food is found to be level 5, can people with levels 5 to 7 tolerate this food?
Generally speaking, yes.
Perfect. Well, that was an easy one. Thank you. Can you give some examples of how foods, for example, mashed potatoes, could be refreshed when they become stiffer as they cool down after they're served to a patient?
Clearly, Peter, this one's for you.
Yeah, and I think I just alluded to that. Thank you for asking the question. Mashed potatoes is one of those foods that we all prepare in different ways, and everybody has their own recipe, and every chef and cook. The ideal mashed potato is one, as you saw in one of the videos there, that holds a shape, but when you perform the spoon tilt test, it will come off that spoon cleanly. So as I mentioned before, a change in temperature may cause it to become more sticky or become more solidified. And a change in moisture content can also be something that affects it. So I think the key thing we would encourage people to think about is what happened to the food to have caused it to have changed its behavior. So if it's a change in moisture because liquids have evaporated, then a good thing to do would be to add moisture back to it. What we've heard from some operations is they've actually taught people to, 1, warm up the potatoes, and then 2, also to add some hot water back into the potatoes, And all we've done here is really just to refresh the food to its original state. So how much you add, I think that's something that you will have to work through and do the testing on. It doesn't change the nutritional content in any way. We're just really trying to refresh it back to the original state that it was served when it was an ideal product.
Great, thank you, Peter. John, I have one for you. Do industry partners use these IDDSI tests as well for classifying their products?
It is part of what, I can really only speak to what we do, but it is part of our process to make sure that it's part of the QA process. They run an IDDSI flow test just to make sure that we are complying with what we're complying. The limitation, of course, is that we just run it with water, and we know from experience over time how that's going to behave in other beverages as well. And so that's what we do. I assume that if anybody else is labeling their product to meet these standards, that they're running the IDDSI tests as well. I've seen some pressure on occasion from manufacturers I've talked to that they want to keep running their test because they've been using that test for a long time. And I've said to them, well, that's great. You can run your test, but you need to run this IDDSI flow test as well. And it's not that hard to do. It's something new and different, and they don't have the history and the comfort with it. And so they still, take out whatever they're using. I've seen people who use Bostwick consistometers. I've seen people who use Brookfield discometers. But whatever test they're comfortable with and they have a history with, they'll continue to do that, but they've added the IDDSI test on top of it.
Thanks, John. And in consultation with some of the food scientists of the world, particularly in the food oral processing community, we know that not all of the current industry standard testing processes directly map over or is equal to the IDDSI test methods that have been recommended. So IDDSI is working with a panel of experts, and we are going to be consulting an expert panel from the food oral processing world. And this was supposed to be happening in July when there was actually a face-to-face conference scheduled, but it will now happen on a virtual basis. So there'll be more information that will surface from that kind of consultation. So yes, there is ongoing work in the background from IDDSI to make sure that the standardized terminology and the testing methods will be used in all settings, in all cultures, and to be able to support people of all ages.
Great. I think we're going to have to end it there. Thank you, Peter, for answering these questions. And thank you, John, for this incredibly helpful presentation. I think this will be a very valuable resource for folks that are either initiating their testing methods or already in the process of doing that in their facilities. So thank you again for joining us. This marks the end of the webinar. Another reminder that a recording will be available early next week on our website. And if you know of anyone who benefits from listening to it or watching this presentation, please share that with them. And also a reminder that we have another presentation coming up next Friday, May 29th, called IDDSI 301, implementation. We had a few questions regarding implementation, so I hope that you can join us next Friday for that. Thank you so much for all the panelists and all the guests that were joining us today. And a big thank you to John Holahan for your presentation on the IDDSI testing methods. Thank you to you, the listeners, for joining us today. We hope you found this information useful in your practice. We are signing off. Have a great rest of your day. Have a lovely weekend. And until next time, thank you, everybody.